Hi, I'm Randy Bergen, and I am really happy today to have Jeff Olson with us. Jeff is the Financial Aid Director at Bethel University. This is a position he's held since 2005. And Jeff has spent essentially all of his academic career as a Financial Aid Director or in financial aid. Jeff has a bachelor's degree from Crown College, an MBA from the University of St. Thomas, and I'm especially glad to have Jeff here today because he's an alumnus of the EDD program and was a student in one of my classes. So it's really fun to have you here and to have you be a presenter in a class you actually took.
Thank you.
So Jeff, your job is a really important job, Financial Aid Director. It is a job that when I was a college student, I definitely took for granted. And when I was a faculty member, I thought about not at all. Can you help fill in the gaps of knowledge about your position? What exactly does a financial aid director do? And what are your responsibilities?
Sure. In broad strokes, we direct financial aid. But the interesting thing is, for many students, they don't understand what financial aid is, or they understand it in different nuances to what someone working in the aid office would understand. Financial aid involves a number of different types of aid, grants and scholarships, loans and student employment. And our role in the financial aid office is to identify the sources of the aid and to make sure we can get it to students in an equitable manner.
Great. So there are a lot of sources of aid. Can you talk about those sources of aid, the kinds of aid that you distribute? And it's millions of dollars in our budget. How do you track all that money that comes in? And you're also responsible to report it to government agencies.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of the different types of financial aid, we think of gift aid and self-help aid. So gift aid would include grants and scholarships, and that's the type of aid that most students want to receive because they don't have to pay it back. Other types of aid would be loans and student employment eligibility. In terms of where the money comes from and how we track it and we get it into the students' pockets, some of the money will come from the institution, some of the money will come from the federal government or the state government. Some of the monies come from private entities. Might be a foundation like a Page Foundation or a local group like a Lions Club or Rotary Club. And so in terms of setting up processes to make sure that students can receive these different types of aid, it involves the financial aid office then understanding each funding source's rules and regulations, so that we're able then to develop processes that help students to meet the application timeline, understand how these different types of aid, how they all fit together, and at the end of the day are able to enroll and graduate from college.
Mm-hmm. So to track all that, how many, we got at Bethel, there are about 5,000 students roughly. How many staff do you have delivering financial aid to those students?
12.8 FTE in our office. Currently to work with those students.
Yeah, so it's your load is heavy.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Government programs are complex and they change all the time. I would imagine that the complexity of that makes your job like doing taxes all the time almost. What are your thoughts about the impact of those programs? Is it worth the effort to track those millions of dollars? The government is investing billions of dollars a year in financial aid, and they do it because they believe it is for the common good, right? So when you think about the impact of Title IV funding and the enormous amount of aid that goes to student loans, is it accomplishing what you think it needs to accomplish for the common good? Is it doing what the government intends? As someone who lives in the trenches and sees the impact in students' lives.
It's a big question, and there's nuances to the answer. The simple answer is, I think it is making progress towards accomplishing the goal. And the challenge is understanding what that goal is. For some of us in higher education, we get really focused in saying the goal is the success or the viability of the specific program that we're involved in. The EDD program, is that program thriving or not? From a societal perspective, it's asking the question, do we have enough trained citizenry in order to be competitive in the global marketplace? And financial aid, it bounces back and forth between those which are sometimes competing objectives. Many times people will think about financial aid as it's helping needy students. And different colleges, universities take very different approaches in how to allocate out their institutional money. Some schools, you might think of a Harvard, and they'll be in the news saying, we're going to help all the needy students to be able to enroll, and they won't have to borrow a loan. They're able to do that because of the size of their endowment. Other schools go to the other extreme and they say, we're not going to pay attention to the family's ability to afford education. We want to look at what merit, what are the extra skills and abilities that individual students bring to the university, and we'll give institutional money because of academics or because of athletics or because of some other circumstance, but not looking at the pocketbook. A school like Bethel, we take a hybrid approach, and we're looking at some of each of those resources. And I think one of the big challenges in asking the question, are we accomplishing the goal, is what is the goal? Missionally, we're here to say it's better for the kingdom of God to have students enroll at a school like a Bethel University, where we can try to help them grow and understand their faith and how to integrate that into life. And that's better for our society than having the same student go and graduate from a school that doesn't have that faith-based center. And so to the degree that we are increasing our enrollment, that feels like we're accomplishing our goals and objectives. The challenge is sometimes the financial aid programs don't necessarily help us to increase our enrollment, or there are conflicting issues that come into play that prevent us from being able to accomplish those goals. So again, big picture in terms of the involvement of the federal government, when we stop and look at how much federal grant aid or state grant aid or federal loan money our students are receiving, I think it's about $23 million that students in the traditional undergrad program received in the forms of loans. Of that, roughly 80% was from the federal government. In terms of federal or state grants that are coming through, it's probably Minnesota State grant around $3 to $4 million a year for our traditional undergrad program, and the Pell Grant another couple million on top of that. And so for a school like Bethel to not provide federal and state, or access to federal and state financial aid resources, we would be really hard pressed to help those students to be able to afford to come into the university. So there's a price that we pay for the complexity of the regulations, but it's all about accomplishing our mission and objective of providing a Christ-centered education.
Right. Now, one of the criticisms of those aid programs is they actually inflate the price. So the Bennett hypothesis says that because there are these federal and state programs that give away free money, we take advantage of that as a university and we use that to jack up our price. What are your thoughts about the validity of the Bennett hypothesis? I didn't prepare you for that question, but
no, that's fine.
It's a fascinating question to me.
It gets at some of the fundamental principles of why we spend money the way we do. And one of the principles along with that is the idea that in a nonprofit entity, how do we evaluate our success? And we evaluate the success by spending all of the money. And so that ties in with the Bennett hypothesis in the sense of, are there good motivations in why we're spending the money? But I disagree with the Bennett hypothesis from the perspective of thinking that there's ill will. I think one of the challenges in higher education is that for many years, there was enough demand that we were able to raise our price at a rate that met our needs. Mm-hmm. And in the last 15 years or so, with the rise of the internet, the general population is saying the kind of information that used to only be available in academia, that same information is now available for free in many other sources. And so it challenges this question of, can higher education continue to simply raise our price because that's how much we think we need to pay the bills? And how do we make adjustments in our culture to say we now have to be sensitive to what the marketplace is willing to pay? And that's a very different mindset.
So if I'm understanding this, you're saying that Google is undermining our pricing structure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that is not an idea that I've read about widely. I think that's a very fascinating question. Is the availability of knowledge undermining the tuition pricing structure that we have in universities?
My sense is yes, it is, and that higher education hasn't caught on to that yet, and that contributes towards this sense of why is it that families are unwilling to pay our asking price in the numbers that we think they should. It's harder and harder for them to accept the fact that the price that we are asking, even with large scholarships or grants going out to help students, it's harder for them to accept the fact that this is a worthy investment when I can get a lot of that information much cheaper. So I think there is a shift in the mindset of our general population and what they're willing to pay because of the easy access to information that couldn't get at before without being in a higher ed setting.
Right. Well, the current environment is definitely a difficult environment in higher education. From the perspective of a financial aid director, what are some of the other biggest challenges that you see for higher education generally? The funding that you bring into the university is, so you talked about $23 million coming through federal and state aid
Loans.
Programs.
Yeah.
And we have probably another $38 million coming in from unfunded institutional gift aid. And on top of that, I'm guessing there are private sources, and in addition to that, I believe that there are loans.
Right.
So when you put all that together, how much do you think of the total budget at Bethel is coming through all of those sources? So of the revenue that we bring in, I didn't ask you this in advance, so you may not be prepared for it, but it's a lot of money, right? 70% of the budget?
For Bethel in 16-17, it was about $74 million that came in some type of financial aid program.
Right. So our expense budget, it makes that roughly 75% of all the dollars we spend. That's a huge amount of money. So financial aid and pricing structures are really a major part of the challenges that we've got in higher education. Can you elaborate on what you see as those challenges that we're facing into right now?
I think one of the fundamental challenges of schools like a Bethel in higher education is the dichotomy between faculty and staff, and it ties back to this concept of shared governance. And where we're asking faculty members, we're bringing them on board and we're saying, you are very gifted, you're very knowledgeable, we want you to invest your skills, your resources to develop this exceptional academic program, and then we're going to hire other people who are going to come alongside and try to recruit students to come in to learn from you. And to the degree that there's always enough money to pay the bills, that relationship works pretty well. But when the budget gets tighter and we're not able to enroll enough students, then tensions flare. And part of the challenge that universities have to wrestle with is to what extent do we hold faculty members accountable for the number of students that are in their program. And if we have an exceptional basket weaving course and 2 students take it, but we're paying the faculty the same as if there were 40 people in the class, at some point in time the universities have to lean into that and recognize that either we need to find a way to make it more affordable to teach the course and continue teaching it, or maybe there's just not enough marketplace demand for this particular course and we need to phase that out. So the whole idea of is we're looking at how to help families afford to come to college. One avenue is let's give you more resource, more financial aid, grants or scholarships to help you pay. And the other question is asking, to what extent are we intentionally trying to find ways to reduce the cost of delivering a quality education? And in a traditional undergrad environment like a Bethel, we haven't leaned as much into the second half of that equation as we have in some of our non-traditional delivery systems.
Sure. Right. I think, when you're hiring a faculty member, you're hiring a person with a fairly narrow band of expertise. So if the enrollment in in the program that faculty member teaches in declines, you have very limited choices in what you can do to respond. You could let the person go. You could reduce the pay, which is very difficult. Or you could ask the person to teach outside of their area. in which case you're compromising the quality. And so I think there are some things that are structural to higher education where because of the narrow expertise that takes years to develop, and you're asking a person to invest their lives in a program, they're almost draconian decisions that you have to make when you're thinking about, okay, enrollment's dropped, what are we going to do now? So the cost structure of higher education is really very different than it might be, say, in a factory where you can retool the same line, the same employees can make a different widget. If there's a demand drop for a particular widget, you can find a different thing to develop. You can use the same employees, right? But in higher education, you can't just switch out faculty like that. And that makes the responsiveness of the industry to changes in the industry really more complicated, I think, than they might be in some other businesses. So I think you're raising a really crucial point that gets at how does higher education change when student demand changes if we have an employment structure that takes years to develop someone for a position and then there's no longer demand for that position. You can either let the person go, which impacts the community significantly. You can cut the person's pay, which makes them less committed to the community, or you can compromise educational quality by trying to reallocate that training in a different area that they're less knowledgeable about. So that's where I live all the time, right? And that's why we've gone to an adjunct model for adult and graduate education to a large degree,
right,
because that gives us options. But if we don't go to an adjunct model and we use tenured faculty, then we have very few options. And I know you've raised the question of tenure to me. Do you see tenure as a primary problem in higher education from a perspective of a financial aid director who's given out 75% of the dollars that we spend?
I do. I see it as how do you attract people to come into a profession that requires so much of an investment to get to the knowledge level that they can be the experts in their field? Tenure is a great carrot to be able to attach out there and say, we're going to guarantee you this long-term position. But my sense is that there hasn't been a reality check in is that an appropriate benefit? And it's almost like the pensions that university or businesses and universities used to offer to be able to guarantee that you come work for us and we're going to give you a pension. And regardless of what happens out in the marketplace in your retirement years, we're going to guarantee you a sum of money. And businesses and universities have recognized they're not able to support these pension funds any longer, and have then moved much more in the direction of some type of a 401k plan where the employee shares the risk in what happens in the marketplace. And I think that's the kind of question that higher ed needs to lean into in the concept of the tenure. How do you continue to create an environment that's going to motivate people to want to dedicate their lives to a particular level of expertise? And yet, how do we do this in a way that they share an appropriate level of the risk when there's no longer enough interest in what their expertise is for the university to warrant offering that program or that course?
Right. It's a question that will drive change in the academy over the next 2 decades, I'm guessing. Although I started graduate school in 1985, and my first year in grad school, my primary faculty member, my main prof, said, you know, you won't even get tenure because it's going to go away by the time you come up for tenure. So I came up for tenure in 1995 or 1996, and I got tenure, right? So change in the academy is very slow. Tenure may be going away, but it's not clear when.
Right.
And we know that the changes we're experiencing in higher education in this decade, in the 21st century, is it feels very different from what's come before, and it does feel like we're at a pivot point. And I think that federal aid, state aid is in large part driving some of these changes. Certainly the financial model is driving the changes. And you're living with the indigestion of all of those changes probably. So in the middle of the pressures that you feel, you've been in this kind of role, certainly in this specific job since 2005, but really you've been doing this for more than 20 years. How do you stay happy in your job? What gives you joy in what you do?
Oh, that's a great question. I came home last night after work, and I had gone to a local high school, Coon Rapids High School, and there was an event there for the community where people could come and get help filling out their free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA form that all students apply for in order to be qualified for need-based types of aid and some non-need-based. And spent a couple hours there, and I spent about an hour of my time with a mom and her son, Spanish-speaking mom primarily. She spoke some English, but we had some challenges in our communication back and forth. And I helped her figure out how to access her email. She thought she had a Hotmail account, ended up it was a Gmail account. And we spent about an hour trying to get her set up so that she could electronically sign her son's free application for federal student aid. And I went home thrilled. Thrilled because I had an opportunity to impact one family's life. I didn't know them. I'll probably never see them again. It's a young man that wants to be going to aeronautics and will probably go to community college up in the Duluth area. But it's that opportunity to impact individuals' lives that motivates me. The Bible talks about different types of spiritual gifts, and I interpret that as there's motivational gifts that God gives to each of us. I think my spiritual gift is helps, and what motivates me is helping people. So in thinking about my work in the financial aid office, is that opportunity to connect with an individual family and be able to help them to be able to see these are resources that are available that will help the student to attain their goal, that will help the family to not go into too much debt. Part of my role is trying to help at the government level and advocating on behalf of changes in financial aid programs that will help the state accomplish its goals and help students to be able to get into what they're doing. Part of my role is the recording and reporting back to institutional leaders to help them understand where we at financially, what's our discount rate, can we afford to pay our bills. And so it's that idea of this underlying premise of I love to help people, and yet being able to do that in the context of a specialized area, a niche like financial aid, I find it very rewarding.
Well, that is what Bethel is all about, is helping individual students thrive and be transformed. So your sense of mission really comes through. Jeff, thanks for taking time out today to talk to me.
It's my
and
pleasure.
I know the students will benefit from that. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.